Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. All right, thank you all very much for listening. And that is it for our papers today. GBT5 students are going to be given a free dinner coming up. It will not be in and out, but it will be good, I can assure you. So please do come back around. I'm not quite sure what time that starts, but you are welcome just to hang out here and enjoy yourselves and savor your last bits as students this week. So, but also I need 14 chairs, 16 chairs here, but the rest of them would be very nice if you could stack them out there, and that would be very helpful. So, thank you.
In the mail for now, and then this is Sydney's, it's cash. It's inside. Yeah, so it's her 250 late fee, and
That's how you look over.
12-hour days in the pool. So she does. So she'll probably never be able to get here. My other friend's brother's daughter, Sophia, she's taking. Yeah. So my other niece, Sydney, is taking Michelle's class this summer to join GBT2.
Oh, I think I knew that. And it was.
Gods have been a common topic written about through literature. Authors have either written about gods that have been convenient for them, or they have attempted to discover a god that logically exists. The gods written about by Homer and the atoms written about by Lucretius were structured for convenience for the authors. The gods that Homer wrote about were similar to humans with the exception that they had supernatural powers. These gods were convenient for him because they provided an explanation for circumstances outside of human control. They were relatable to mortals because of their human characteristics. The atoms Lucretius described were convenient for him because they gave an explanation as to why the universe existed, but did not place moral restrictions on him. Anselm and Descartes proved that God existed through logical proofs and reasoning. Anselm proved through logic that there was a being that existed which was greater than any other. Descartes demonstrated that there was a God that had placed the knowledge of perfection into the human race. These authors' gods split into two different variations of God. One was a God that was convenient for the author, the other was proven through logic. Homer was attracted to a God that explained natural events that had weaknesses that he could relate to. Lucretius created his atoms so they would not influence his day-to-day life. It explained the question of existence. Descartes and Anselm used logical proofs to formulate that there was a God that existed. Pascal said in The Great Wager, if a God existed, that God should be respected and worshipped because the case for believing in that God was better than the reasons for rejecting him. Gods have been a topic of discussion throughout time, in which they have either been created by authors because they were convenient for them, or writers have used logic to prove that a God existed, in which case he should be worshipped. The gods that Homer discussed were chronicled about in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Throughout these stories, the gods displayed characteristics similar to Homer's, experiencing many of the same feelings and emotions that he would have felt. An example of when gods displayed human feelings and emotions was in the Iliad, where Aphrodite displayed prejudice, the ability to be injured, and underwent emotions similar to mortals, all of which experienced in a more human way. Aphrodite displayed the human attribute of favoritism towards the Trojan hero Aeneas by trying to save him from the war. While Aphrodite was rescuing him, she was wounded by Diomedes, exhibiting the human capacity to be injured. After she was wounded, she fled to Olympus and complained to Dion about being harmed, stating, "The son of Titus stabbed me, Diomedes, yet overweening, insolent, all because I was bearing off myself from the fighting. Aeneas, dearest to me of all men alive. Look down, it is no longer a ghastly war for Troy and Archaea. Now I tell you, the Argives fight the god." Aphrodite displayed three human qualities during this conversation. First, she exhibited the human attribute of slander, which she did by insulting Diomedes because he had stolen her son from her while she was rescuing him from war. Second, she exhibited favoritism towards Aeneas through no basis other than that he was her son. Third, she exhibited to have preferential treatment. She expected to have preferential treatment because she was a god. She exhibited that she desired this conduct because she was frustrated that she had been injured. Aphrodite showed that she was similar to people. She had the same desires as mortals. Homer's gods also showed inconsistency by varying their judgments the same way that people did. In the Odyssey, Poseidon showed that he varied his punishments depending on the offender. The Cyclops had been eating Odysseus' men, which Poseidon ignored. But when Odysseus blinded the Cyclops to escape, he was punished for the next 10 years by Poseidon. Poseidon revealed that he was flawed because he was irregular with his punishments. Another human quality the gods had was that they did not agree with each other. This was seen in the play Antigone, when the gods were not in agreement with each other on the laws that they ordered people to follow. The first law, which was followed by Creon, was that vandals of temples and shrines should be punished. This law was disobeyed by Polynices, who burned temples and desecrated shrines, and was dutifully punished by King Creon. The second law was that families should bury each other. Because Polynices had been killed in battle, he had not been punished in life for destroying the temples and shrines. Creon decided that Polynices still deserved to be punished, so he did not bury him, banishing him to an eternity of wandering the dishonorable side of the river Styx. The gods punished Creon because he did not follow the second law that he should bury his family, though this law contradicted the first law to punish desecrators of temples and shrines, which he did the only way that had been available to him. These were the gods that the Greeks believed were convenient for them. They believed that these gods' existence explained natural disasters because of their supernatural powers, and these gods were relatable because of their human characteristics. The Greeks appreciated stories such as the one between Diomedes and Aphrodite because it demonstrated that though the gods possessed powers that people did not, they still had attributes similar to them. The Greeks wanted a god they could believe in that was more powerful than them but was relatable. Another variation of a supreme being was formulated by Lucretius. He believed in atomism, which was the idea that the world was created by random movements of atoms. Atomists believed that everything was equal because it was all made from the same atoms. Lucretius stated, "It remains to show that nothing exists that is distinct from both body and vacuity." He believed that because everything was created by atoms, everything was equal. Lucretius said, "I have already shown that nothing can be created from nothing. The atoms must be imperishable stuff." His idea that everything was eternal led to the theory that the universe was made from the same imperishable stuff, which meant the entire cosmos was constructed from the same material, cycling through different formations. The idea that everything was equal implied people universally had the same entitlement to decide what was right and what was wrong because they are all made from atoms. Lucretius went on to state that because everything was the same, there was nothing greater, so he logically came to the conclusion that because there was nothing greater, there is no divinity, only arrangements of atoms. He said, "Bear this well in mind, and you will immediately perceive that nature is free and uncontrolled by proud masters and turns the universe by herself without the aid of gods." Lucretius stated that there were not gods that influenced the cosmos. The reason why Lucretius desired a being that established the universe but was an enemy was that it meant that there was no compatibility morally between humans and a higher being. The consequence of this was people could do whatever they wished without being influenced by a higher being which enforced a moral law. Lucretius, like Homer, created a being that he believed was convenient for him. Anselm, a Christian philosopher, believed that it was more efficient to demonstrate the existence of God through proofs rather than to use the Bible. Anselm proved the existence of God through the formula, "a being than which nothing greater can be conceived." He reasoned that because humans have the knowledge of this being that was greater, that it must have existed because existing was greater than non-existence. Anselm declared that this God must have a variety of attributes under his definition. First, it must be a being that was not made by another essence, but created everything else. Anselm perceived that there must have been a beginning to the universe, yet a being that had less power than creation was large could not have produced the cosmos. Second, This being must be all-powerful, not having limits to its prowess. Anselm discerned that the greater being must have an infinite capability because possessing unlimited power was greater than having a restricted influence. Third, Anselm's reasoning led him to the conclusion that because perfection was the measure of the greatest, then this God must have been the standard that perfection was measured to. Anselm used logic to prove that there is a supreme being instead of creating a God that was convenient for him. Descartes discussed another God, which he formulated through logic. Descartes believed that a God should be proven through logic so that there were not prejudice from the author which influenced the God that had been discerned. He began with man, which he believed was the being that was closest related to God, because the knowledge of perfection that mankind had. He said, it is no less contradictory that the more perfect should proceed from and depend on the less perfect than it is something should proceed from nothing. There remains the only possibility that it had been put into me by nature that was truly more perfect than mine. Descartes believed that there was a God because humans had the knowledge of perfection even though they were imperfect. Descartes believed that because he was a lesser being which had the knowledge of a larger idea, of the larger idea of perfection, that a larger being must have placed that knowledge into him. This was persuasive for the same reason Euclid's common notion was convincing: the whole is greater than the part. Because humans were finite, imperfect beings, they were not capable of grasping the knowledge of perfection. But people contained the knowledge of perfection, implying that an infinite, perfect being had placed that knowledge into man. An additional argument that Descartes used was the fact that people had knowledge of truth. Descartes said, it is evident that it is no less contradictory that falsity or imperfection as such proceed from God than that the truth or perfection should proceed from nothingness. But if we did not know that everything is real and true within us comes from a perfect and infinite being, then however clear and distinct our ideas were, we would have no reason to be sure that they had the perfection of being true. Descartes formulated that because people knew the difference between right, truth, and falsity, there must have been a God that instilled the knowledge of truth into people. Descartes continued his analysis of truth, that because there is an ideal such as truth, the supreme being that created everything must be the standard for it. Another reason why Descartes believed there must be a God was because the knowledge of right and wrong was known to man. C.S. Lewis made the same argument that because man understood a crooked line, he must have possessed the knowledge of a straight line. This was different than the gods previously discussed, because this God was not convenient for Descartes, but was the logical conclusion that Descartes ended with from his chain of logic. The gods that have been discussed can be broken down into two categories. The first class were the gods described by Homer and the atoms described by Lucretius, which were tailored for convenience for themselves. The second variation of gods were described by Anselm and by Descartes, who tried to discover a divine being through logic. The concept that Anselm used was that there was a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. The reason why this was not changing the conception of God to which was convenient for Anselm was because he could not change which was greater, because he was not capable of imagining such a being. Descartes used logic, which did not allow him to change his God to one that was convenient for him. His argument was that because there was a God, because the knowledge of perfection must have been placed into mankind by a creator, because they had the knowledge of flawlessness but were imperfect. Descartes was convinced that people were not capable of creating the knowledge of perfection because they were imperfect. In addition, Descartes believed that something that was as perfect as truth could not come from man, but must have had a standard that was perfect to which it was measured. Descartes came to the conclusion that there must be a God because man had knowledge of perfection and knew the difference between right and wrong. The reason why these authors were persuasive was because they did not let their personal ideals for a deity infiltrate their logic they used to find a God. Because Descartes and Anselm produced evidence for their ideas, their proofs could be used to examine the gods discussed by Homer and atoms formulated by Lucretius. The gods that Homer described did not fit the definition that Anselm used to prove a god. The Greek gods had faults because they were relatable to humans, so they were not greater but only more powerful. Anselm's formula for a god was that he was greater than anything, saying, it is certain then that though the supreme nature of God, whatever is not identical with it, has been created. He said that whatever is not equal with God has been created, but humans were equal with Homer's gods in some features. Another reason why Greek gods were not a being than which nothing greater could be conceived was because they had the ability to be injured, which made them equal in this aspect to man. Homer's gods did not fulfill the requirements that Descartes set, that a god was to be capable of instilling perfection inside a man because they were not perfect. Descartes said that a god must be a flawless being that was perfect, capable of instilling the knowledge of ideals into mankind, because humans had the knowledge of perfection, yet were imperfect beings. The Greek gods were not capable of instilling perfection because they possessed human vice. They were not the measure of truth that Descartes discussed because they told lies and deceived one another. The gods that were discussed by Homer did not fit the definition of either Anselm or Descartes because they had weaknesses and were imperfect. The atoms that Lucretius wrote about did not fit either concept formulated by Anselm or Descartes. Anselm said that the supreme being was greater than anything, but Lucretius' atoms were what made up everything, so they were equal to everything. The atoms were not the God that Descartes formulated because they were not capable of instilling the idea of perfection or morality into people because they were inanimate beings. Homer's gods and Lucretius' atoms did not fit the definitions of a supreme being. Yet Anselm and Descartes proved that there was a being that was greater than man that existed. The being they described must have been greater than any being in existence. It must have imbued the human race with the idea of perfection and was the measurement of truth. The God that was recorded in the Bible fits the definitions of both Anselm and Descartes. The God from the Bible fit the definition of Anselm because he was greater than any being in creation, he was the creator of everything, and he was incomprehensible to mankind. The God from the Bible also fit the definitions given by Descartes. He was capable of placing the knowledge of perfection into man because he was flawless. The question that must be addressed was if this God did exist, why should people believe in him? It came down to the attributes that this God possessed. If it was a supreme being similar to the atoms described by Lucretius, then there was not a convincing argument to trust and believe in them because the atoms were incapable of enforcing laws. If the divinity that exists were the gods described by Homer, it would be necessary to worship the god. It would not be necessary to worship the gods because they were in some aspects equal to the human race. But if the God that was described in the Bible, there is much more, and there was much more at stake. The Bible said God punished those who did not worship him. Pascal, the author of Pensées, said that there is much more profit in believing that God existed than denying that he did. He thought that the reason people did not worship God was because they did not wish to live with the implications of living with a God that was perfect. The gods described by Homer and Lucretius were gods for convenience, while the God described by Anselm and Descartes was perfect. Pascal believed that the God from the Bible, existed, and he believed that he would punish those who did not worship him. He said, let us assess the two cases. If you win, you win everything. If you lose, you lose everything. Pascal believed that there were two decisions that people could make. They could believe, trust, and worship God, or they could ignore him and live their life however they wished. The first option, according to Pascal, was better because the God from the Bible rewarded those who worshipped him. Accordingly, he believed that if man denied God, discussed in the Bible, then as described in the Bible, God would punish the people that had rejected him. Since the beginning of time, there have been a wide diversity of gods that humans have worshipped. These gods split into two different types of gods. One was created for convenience, while the other was proven through logic. The God described by Homer were convenient for the Greeks because they gave reasons for events that occurred that were outside the Greeks' control. These gods were relatable to the Greeks because of their human attributes. They were beings the Greeks could blame for circumstances outside of their control because of the power the gods possessed. Yet they were relatable because of their human characteristics. Lucretius did not believe in a god, but believed the world was made of atoms, which were in control of everything. The atoms influenced the physical universe, yet were equal to everything because they were what made up everything. The atoms were similar to the gods discussed by Homer because the atoms, like the gods, were convenient for Lucretius. they allowed him to have an answer for the creation of the universe. Because everything was created from atoms, everything was equal, so there were no moral restrictions for what was right or wrong. The other variation of gods were discussed by Anselm and Descartes, which they formulated through logic. They created definitions of the characteristics that a true God should possess. Because Anselm and Descartes used proofs for their gods, their proofs were used to analyze Homer's and the gods and Lucretius' atoms. Anselm said that a god was a being that was greater than any entity that could be conceived. People had knowledge of this being, which because it was so great, could not be created by the human imagination. Descartes followed similar logic that because imperfect people had knowledge of perfection, there must be a God that placed that awareness inside of mankind. Neither Homer's gods or Lucretius' atoms fit the definition of either Anselm or Descartes, but the God that was depicted in the Bible did. The God in the Bible fit the definition of both Anselm and Descartes, because the God from the Bible was greater than any being in existence and was capable of instilling perfection into mankind. The skull reasoned that because there was a prospect that this God existed, there was an equal chance that this God would punish man. The skull believed the rewards for believing in this God from the Bible outweighed the punishments that were involved if he was denied. Between the God of convenience described by Homer and Lucretius and the God proven by logic by Anselm and Descartes, the God described in the Bible was the supernatural divinity that deserved to be worshipped.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hinrichs. I have a question I'd like us to begin with, and that is, you've given two images for the understanding of God that have been common in history, the God derived from proof and the attributes that can be derived by that, and the God, as you call it, the God of convenience, which is posited in order to explain certain necessary elements of the world. I was not clear in the end how your understanding of the God of the Bible is to be seen as either agreeing or disagreeing with either of those particular ways of understanding God.
Okay, so in my paper, I think that the God depicted by Anselm and Descartes is pretty clearly seen in the God of the Bible, like their proofs describe the God of the Bible. And so I think he's a God of proofs and reasoning because he's not very convenient for anybody. Because he might answer questions, but he doesn't allow loopholes that people can get through, like the gods that were the Greeks and Romans, they could be bribed kind of for sacrifices. And the atoms like Lucretius were convenient because they just didn't apply any moral law to anybody.
Are you saying that the Christian understanding of God should not be used as an explanation for the way things are? You talk about the pagans giving God's existence as an explanation for why thunder comes, or these sorts of things. When someone asks, well, why did this happen? And a Christian says, well, because that's the way God wanted it. Is that a sort of pagan use of God's existence, or you'd say, was that consistent with a Christian understanding of God?
So because Anselm and Descartes describe the God in the Bible, because it's described the God in the Bible, anything that's said in the Bible can be counted as true. Because they describe the God of the Bible. And so, because they describe the God in the Bible, anything in the Bible can be counted as how God is. And if the Bible says God is in control of everything, which it does, then you could use it as in that this is what God said this and that's why it happened.
One of the criticisms of pagan gods is that they are a sort of God that's created in man's own, and has various notions about God that he comes up with, and he puts those onto God. And if you do a proof to prove God's existence, is the understanding of God that you get from that proof similarly a projection of your own nature onto God? Like with Anselm's definition, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Is that way of explaining God similarly like those pagan notions, that it's just putting an idea onto God that's really just our own human invention rather than who he truly is?
So, I definitely think it's impossible to understand the immensity of God because that's part of Anselm's definition. So, the difference with, like, I think between the gods described in, like, the Iliad and the Odyssey is it really tries to explain the whole God. And so, I would say that the, like, Anselm's proof is not it's just using logic instead of, and denying that you can know the immensity of God, which is kind of, I think, different than trying to depict a God.
What is your thought about the use of proofs for God's existence when we really don't seem to find anything like the proofs of Augustine or Anselm in the scriptures themselves? The scriptures give some evidence for God's existence, but the sort of formal logical proofs that Anselm works out, really nothing like that in the scriptures. And does that make you come to the conclusion that these proofs that we give, it's really not a very sound way of trying to develop an understanding of God?
So I think what's interesting with so Descartes and Anselm's proofs aren't canon, like the Bible is. But what's interesting is they describe the God depicted in the Bible at least an aspect of him, very well. So, though the arguments aren't in the Bible itself, it depicts a section of the Bible. So, or a part of God's character, which I think is one reason why they're not in the Bible, is because the Bible is telling the things that God has done, and it's never really describes who God is. It says certain characteristics, but it doesn't ever explain his existence. It says that he existed in the beginning, but it never says how he existed.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the theological authors that we've read have come to the conclusion that we cannot grasp the essence of God. We can see characteristics, but what his actual essence is something that's far beyond our comprehension. And, like with a hammer, you can see the characteristics of a hammer, but you can also grasp what the essence of a hammer is, a device to force fastening devices into other material. You can understand the essence of a hammer. But with God, people have said, you know what, you can understand some of his characteristics, but grasping his essence is simply not possible. In Anselm's proof, when he gives that definition for God's existence, God is that then which nothing greater can be conceived, is he giving us a sort of false summation of what God's essence is?
Well, for Anselm's proof, it's really almost saying exactly that you can't, it's that than which nothing greater can be conceived, which really is incomprehensible to man, I believe. So he's just surmising what the Bible says already, that it's impossible to grasp God in his infinitude, that he is greater than anything else that can be conceived. So I would say Anselm's proof is just re-saying that he can't be grasped.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. All right, other questions?
Jonathan, great job. Your paper was very interesting. Tackled the question. I have 4 questions. My first question is, you talked a lot about people creating gods for convenience, and then you gave the example of Aphrodite and like the Greek gods. But I'm kind of wondering what is convenient about the Greeks making their own gods, because then they had to have temples, then whatever the prophets or the Oracle of Delphi, whatever they said, the gods said, that became their laws. And there were some pretty ridiculous things, and whatever the gods told them to do, they had to do. And it just seemed like a terrible inconvenience for them. So maybe could you explain more why it was convenient for them to have the Greek gods, aside from just explaining things?
So yeah, one aspect is that it explains things, and the other is it was very convenient for the priests in Temple of Delphi to have the gods, because it let them have, like, they had everybody bring the stuff to their temple, which is really the priest's house, because the priest would live in the temple and have the stuff they bring to them. And so I believe that it probably started out as, like, the way that the Greek gods kind of evolved was it started out as an explanation for certain things, and then a couple of people thought it'd be nice if they could get things from other people by saying that the gods want you to. The priest kind of made up things like, the gods want you to bring me 3 cows and a bunch of gold for a sacrifice.
So it's convenient for the priests.
Yeah, and then they would have, I don't know how else they would enforce that, but that's really what it was convenient for.
Okay. Interesting. My second question is, I was thinking, wasn't kind of the Christian religion, you could say, really just us being convenient? Because, hey, all you have to do is pray to God, and He will forgive you of all your sins, and you can go to heaven and have everlasting life in a super awesome place. And all you have to do is sign the paper, yes, I follow God. You don't have to make sacrifices. You don't even have to go to church. You know, it's a pretty convenient religion, you could say. So isn't Christianity really making that same fault?
I would say no, because that's what my paper is about. But I would think, so the gods, or God, is not convenient for people because He requires really so much. You can't follow, like, a lot of the Greek gods allowed a bunch of really bad things to happen and encourage them. And while in the Christian religion, you're supposed to deny this world and look forward to the next, which is much harder than the Greek gods and some of the other people that just completely denied a God, because they just conform to the world immediately. And while we try to deny the world and look to the next, which is much harder to do than, like, for instance, the Greeks, really, the world was what to live for, and Hades was, like Achilles said, it was better to be one day than as a farmer's lowly hand than forever at the highest position in Hades. So really, that's the difference between Christians and non-Christians, is we have something to look forward to that is guaranteed, but it's something that we have to have faith in. While the Greeks and Romans, it was kind of like, even if we died and didn't have anything else after life, it wouldn't really matter.
What about other religions like Buddhism, that still have a lot of, they still have a lot of, moral things you could say in their religion, taking good care of things, kind of respecting other people, and that's not easy to do as well. So could other religions also fit under your definition?
So, things like Buddhism, which don't Buddhists believe that when they die, they become like one with everything?
There's definitely, it's different than Christianity, but they also have a lot of morals in their religion as well.
Mm-hmm. So, from Buddhist is from India, right? Indian country. Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
And so, a lot of Indians are the poverty there is really, really bad. And so, really, for a lot of people, because it's a huge country and a lot of people because they have their class system and everything. And so, when Buddhism began, a lot of people didn't want to live in the world, but to really become part of everything else that was better than their current circumstances. So, wait, what was your question?
Okay, I was kind of curious, but my last question is, I was wondering, you also contrast it to the idea of like logically proving God, and that's what Anselm and Descartes do, and that's what fits with the God of the Bible, and that's good, but isn't man's act only accepting God when they can logically prove Him kind of us trying to make God convenient and us trying to, like Mr. H said, project our ideas of God onto Him?
So, So your question was,
Isn't the process by Anselm and Descartes trying to logically prove God,
so it's convenient.
making God convenient and projecting man's ideas onto him?
Well, so like Descartes said, there's this idea that's impossible to formulate through man by himself, which is perfection, which it's making it easier to understand, but I don't know if it's making God more convenient. It's having him knowing that he exists, but not knowing exactly what he is, or exactly like this is exactly how God is. So it's not making it's not making God more convenient. It's making God more, I guess you could say, understandable. Does that answer your question?
Yes. What's the difference between like understandable and convenient? Because with the Greeks and like Lucretius, it was a way to explain things, and that's what made it convenient. So what's the difference?
So I guess the main difference between the convenience that it is to understand things and the convenience that was talked about in Lucretius and Homer's Gods was the convenience to understand God was different than the convenience to understand the world. A major part of Lucretius and Homer's Gods were understanding the events that occurred in the world, while the convenience that Anselm and Descartes used was to understand God.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
So in your paper you covered, Homer and Lucretius, who they sort of describe gods of convenience, and then you also mentioned Anselm, Descartes, and such, that they tried to find a god of not a god not so much of convenience, but more that could be determined through logic. Why would you suppose that this change was made from wanting to find a god that fit within a certain realm of understanding versus another that trying to find the actual god?
So a major part is, so Homer and Lucretius both weren't Christians, while Descartes and Anselm were. So I would say that's the major difference between them. And yeah, I think that's the major difference between the two. One is trying to just almost provide another reason why the God of the Bible exists, while the other is trying to come up with reasons for events that occur in the world. Jeremiah?
How do you compare Descartes and Anselm trying to define God by logical reasoning, and the people who first formulated the laws of nature, like the formula for gravity? Sir Isaac Newton did not invent gravity, but he used mathematical reasoning and experimentation to figure out a formula for the force of gravity. Is it a similar sort of thing with Descartes and Anselm did not invent a god and put their own image on God, but instead use logic and such to find the I guess, essence of God that was already existing?
Yeah.
So various paper has very good flow. So I wanted to ask, so you compared that, you said that the gods of the Greeks were made in the image of humans, so that they would be flawed and comparable people you could relate to in the story. So what would you say then would be the implications on our character, our characters humans, if we are created in God's image? So what is the characteristics then?
So yes, that's kind of Descartes' thing, is we have the perfection inside of us, which is, like Descartes says, almost like a signature that God places on to the human race. So really, we have something to look that's better than us. While the Greeks and Roman gods weren't really better than humans. Like, sure, they were more powerful, but I would say they're less moral than most humans. Yeah. So Josh?
Yes. Okay. Love your paper, thank you. And so my question. So you said Lucretius created a god of sorts of convenience, right? Because he made it so that there were no moral restrictions, so that there's no way to differentiate from right and wrong. So do you think that without a god, without a belief in God, that there is no morality?
I don't know if without a belief in without a belief in God, but without a God, I definitely think there is no morality. Because there's nothing that a standards to. But if with no belief in God, you can see people trying to make their own laws, and they're still very similar to almost. People definitely have an imprint on their soul of, I forgot who said it, but natural law. That's part of the human race.
Okay, so there's still some morality. It's just not as much, or.
So belief in God, or if there is no God?
Well, I guess with if everybody on earth believes that there was no God, would there still be morality?
I think morality would degrade. I think as soon as you start taking God out of the picture, there's no accountability. And so people will try to have accountability towards humans, but that is almost the same as the Greek gods, which the Greek gods can only be certain places at certain times. So it will really degrade very quickly into no moral laws at all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So, it seems you present 4 positions on the understanding of God, and they all seem very, very logical and in that way sort of convenient. I was wondering where you think sort of feelings and faith fit.
So, for my paper, it's simply just discovering or stating that there's a God that exists. So, once the God that exists, that is God in the Bible, then in the Bible it says things like, I can't remember any Bible verses right now, but it's, you must have faith. So, because the God in the Bible is proved, the God in the Bible, or the Bible is kind of like the rule book to go by. So, yeah.
So while we can use reason to discover different aspects of God, how do we find out what point to stop reasoning? Because, while it always makes sense to reason, there's a point where it's kind of pointless to reason. We know that we aren't going to find anything more. How do we find that?
Like the end of...
Well, the end of reasoning about God, just because there's an infinity of things to know about God, but within that also it's impossible to ever know God. Is there any time where it will be beyond our reason to learn more about God?
Yes, especially when it comes to Jesus and all that. The faith aspects are pretty much, I think, impossible to prove through logic, because faith is impossible to reason through, pretty much.
But God is eternal, so I feel like there are always more things we can discover about Him. But then again, we also can't discover everything about Him because He goes on forever. So what parts, is there a part of His nature that we will never discover?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
It seems that through the logical proofs of God, that there is proven a God, not necessarily the God of the Bible. There could be a perfect entity that's just a watcher God, not an active God, and that is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is a very active God. So the logical proofs do not prove the existence of our God, but just a God. And what do you say to that?
I would disagree. I think, especially with the gods that we read about in GT, like I was saying, the Greek and Roman gods had flaws, so they weren't proven by, they didn't agree with Anselm's God. And then Lucretius Adams were incapable of putting morality into mankind because they were just atoms.
But those aren't the logical proofs. The Anselm says God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So if there is a perfect God who is eternal, who is all powerful, but doesn't use his power, he's just a watcher God, and there's a heaven and hell, and so you have to live a perfect life instead of coming down and saving man. Man has to come to him and earn him. That God could exist within that God is that then which is nothing greater can be conceived.
Yeah, like I was saying before, once you get to the Jesus and faith aspects of Christianity, it's very hard to prove. My paper was just saying the God in the Bible was proven by Anselm's proofs and Descartes' proofs. So it was logically proved by the God in the Bible was logically proved, but I'm sure there could be another God, but I don't know where it is.
The possibility of the God of the Bible being a true thing is proven. But what you have proven through your paper is that there is a God.
Yeah.
You cannot say there is no God, but you have not said that there is our God.
The God in the Bible was proved through Anselm and Descartes' proof. I mean, there are other gods that have those attributes too, but definitively, the proofs did describe Anselm. Anselm and Descartes did prove the God in the Bible.
Like that than which nothing greater can be conceived is just the beginning of all the stuff Anselm goes on. Because he just goes on and
he goes on.
proves, well, if that's true, then this must be true until everything just leads to the good.
Yeah.
So according to Anselm, it's because we as humans believe that we have the image of perfection, then that means, and we are not perfect. So if we have the image of perfection, that means it's something greater than us, a greater being, correct?
Yes. Well, that's Descartes.
Okay. Oh, okay. Then so then we know God by the perfection that he is.
Well, we just know that there must be a more perfect, greater being than us that's capable of possessing perfection and placing knowledge of perfection inside of us.
So when we define perfection by the person that he is.
Yes.
Okay, but then how do we know perfection if we use perfection to define that?
So perfection is a measurement of the greatest and like the most perfect, I guess you could say. So yeah, it really is. I guess you are kind of using the word to describe itself, but
Right. So how do you know the greatest thing if you are using the greatest thing to define that God?
so we simply have a knowledge of perfection, but we don't know specifically what it is. So that's why it proves that there's another God, because we can't possess that knowledge by ourselves. There must have been a greater being that had implanted that knowledge into us. As in Grandma Tom?
Jonathan, Homer and Lucretius were on Earth before the incarnation.
Yes.
All right?
I think so.
And Descartes and Anselm were after
Yes.
the birth of Jesus. So Anselm and Descartes had the Bible.
Yes.
The other guys didn't.
Well, there was still like the Torah and stuff, like the Jewish Bible.
Do you think Homer and Lucretius had access to that when they were developing their gods of convenience? My question is, what impact having the scripture had on these two views of convenience, and then there is a logic to it?
I think that's a very big influence. I believe that Descartes and Anselm are both Christians, which lets them know that so they have accepted that there's a God that's greater, while Lucretius and Homer were looking for answers for life's questions, but wanted it their own way, kind of.